Next, we'll discuss creating custom palettes in more detail. In an earlier lesson, we looked at how to move a brush into a custom palette by holding Shift and dragging it. We also looked at how to change the appearance of the brush icon by right-clicking on it. But we're not only limited to brushes, we can also add commands, media, toolbox tools, dabs, and scripts to a custom palette. I'm going to make this palette larger. Then I'll go to Window, Custom Palette, Add Command. And we can use this to add commands to a custom palette. In case you have multiple custom palettes, you can choose the destination for your command. You can also choose New if you just want to create a new custom palette. I'll choose the Custom 1 palette. Each time you add commands to a custom palette, be sure to make sure the correct palette is selected. Next, select a command that you want to add. You can choose any command from the menu bar, the palette options menu, and from some of the buttons in the panels. Nearly any function in Corel Painter can be made into a shortcut button. For example, I can add the New Layer command from the Layers palette. Once I select a new layer, it is displayed under Menu Item. If I click Add, you can see it appears in the custom palette. I can continue adding commands. Let's add File Place. They will appear to the right of the previous command, so you'll likely need to rearrange the order of the commands by holding Shift and dragging. I'll also add a command for File New, then I'll click on OK. Now I can use these shortcut buttons to create a new canvas, place an image into it, and create a new layer. This is much faster than doing it by clicking in the menus for these commands. If you feel like you're always hunting for a command and you can never remember where it is, just make a shortcut button out of it. Not only will that speed up your workflow, but it can make Corel Painter feel a lot easier to work with. I can customize the layout of the custom palette, and rather than a tall palette stacked 2 by 2, I can have the items flow in a single horizontal row. I can change the order of the items to make them more sequential. I can also modify the icons to make them more intuitive and save space. I'll right-click on the New command. I'll choose Icon View, and many of these commands have their own custom icons. So now we're seeing a new document icon. Let's right-click on Place, and let's choose Icon View. If the command you chose does not have a unique icon, you'll see a flower. This makes it difficult to tell what the command will do, so in this case you'd want to create your own custom icon. We'll take a look at how to do that in a later lesson. You might also look in Painter's icon library to see if there is a pre-existing icon that may suffice. I'll keep the Place icon as Text View. Now let's go ahead and change New Layer to Icon View. This command does have a custom icon depicting a layer stack with a plus sign next to it. There are some limitations, but you have a lot of control over how the commands are displayed in a palette. I'll place my custom palette in the top left of my UI, and I'll expand the palette vertically. Let's see what else we can add to a custom palette. I'll go to Window, Media Panels, Papers, and let's say we really like this Fine Dots paper. I'll hold Shift and drag it into the palette. I'll move a few more papers into the palette as well. Now if I choose a brush like Fat Chalk, I'm able to quickly and easily change the texture applied when I draw, simply by clicking on one of my paper shortcuts. It would be just as easy to keep the Papers palette drawer open and use that to change your paper, but what if you don't use most of the papers? The palette drawer sure takes up a lot of space. Rather than filling your screen with an entire library of content that you don't use, you can isolate the most important content into a smaller palette. I'll close the Papers palette drawer, and let's go to Window, Palette Drawers, Flow Maps. We can also add flow maps to a custom palette. Likewise, you can add textures to a custom palette from the Window menu, Palette Drawers, Texture Painting, and from the Texture library, I'll add the Desk Paint texture. Next, I will go to Window, Palette Drawers, Gradients, and we can add gradients as well. Let's bring in some patterns by going to Window, Palette Drawers, Patterns. Let's go to Window, Palette Drawers, Weaves, and add a weave. From the Window menu, Palette Drawers, Image Hose, we can add some nozzles. And I'll also add some looks from Media Panels, Looks. I think by now you get the point. You can add just about anything to a custom palette. Just hold Shift and try to drag content. If it won't go into the palette, then that's something you can't add. For example, I cannot take the color picker and drag it inside of the custom palette, but I can dock it above or below. Now let's take a look at some of the ways we can manage custom content. Let's begin with palette management options in Window, under Custom Palette. Any custom palettes you create will appear in this menu. It's easy to create a new custom palette by accident, so don't be surprised if there are more in here than you expected. Feel free to delete any palettes you don't want. I'll show you how to do that shortly. At the top of the menu is Organizer. The Custom Palette Organizer allows you to add, remove, and rename custom palettes. You can rename as many palettes as you like, but if you have more than 10, you'll need to use the down arrow on your keyboard to scroll down the list. I'll rename my custom palette to Common Shortcuts. We can also export a custom palette as a box file. I'm going to give it the same name, Common Shortcuts, and be sure to save it somewhere where you'll be able to find it again. I'll put it in my Workspaces test folder. After saving that file, I'll look in that folder. Inside is a file that's called commonshortcuts.box. A box file is a package of everything that is contained within a palette, not the custom palette drawer or anything surrounding the custom palette. A box file will save custom brushes, icon customization, the palette arrangement, commands, and media. In other words, what you see is what you get. And that's important because it takes a lot of effort to arrange a custom palette the way you like it. Let's go to Window Custom Palette Organizer. I'll select Common Shortcuts and delete it. Had I not backed that palette up as a box file or saved my workspace, that customization would be permanently lost. Next, I'll load that saved box file by importing it. As you can see, it restored my custom palette precisely as I saved it. But that's not all that happens when you import a custom palette as a box file. If you look in the brush selector, down at the bottom of the list is a new brush category called Common Shortcuts. That category contains all of the brushes that were located within the palette that I imported as a box file. This is convenient because the box file has automatically linked the brush variants to the custom palette. It's important to know that box files are only compatible with Corel Painter 2016 and later. When you're exporting box files and other types of custom content, keep in mind that the content from newer versions of Painter is not going to be compatible with older versions of Corel Painter. For example, if I were to use Painter 2016 to open any box files I created in the most recent version of Corel Painter, any content that's newer than Painter 2016 wouldn't work.